The title of this panel is Trade and Investment, an Engine for Transatlantic Growth or Fading Illusion. I have to say, when we wrote the title for this, I didn't honestly think that we'd be at such a key moment. Those of us in the think tank world often talk about key moments, but sometimes you really are hit with them in reality. Just as this week has been an interesting one in Polish politics, so it has been an interesting one at the European Parliament, where a key vote on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership was abandoned, and in the US House of Representatives, where the required trade promotion authority was narrowly passed, 219 to 211, so a squeaker, but the associated legislation on trade adjustment assistance was soundly defeated, 302 to 126. This trade adjustment assistance is designed to help displaced workers who have been disadvantaged by shifts in trading patterns. It was overwhelmingly voted down by the Democrats, abandoning it, even though the Democrats have long supported it. The consequence, however, is that the Trade Promotion Authority cannot go forward to be signed by the President because it is linked. The agreement has been made that it would be linked to the trade adjustment assistance. They probably will have a revote early this next week, so this may be something that we will look back on and see as a blip. But it is not clear that the administration can change enough Democratic minds to do this. And I have to say, frankly, reading the reviews of the President's last lobbying effort over the last, I'd say, 36 hours before these votes, it is not clear that he can carry the Democrats or that his intervention has been entirely helpful. Much of this debate in the United States has focused on trade generally, not on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP. If it is talking about a specific agreement, it has been about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And yet, I want to make clear that TTIP has actually been something that has been favored, both by members of Congress, certainly when we talk to them, but also by the US public. 59% of Democrats in the United States who've been polled recently by Pew favor a trade agreement with Europe. 45% of Republicans favor it, so a switch from what you normally think about Congress, where you imagine that Democrats are against and Republicans for trade agreements. 21% are opposed, and interestingly, 28% are undecided, which means that there's an education process that still needs to be very much undertaken. The question for the US is whether the overall debate on trade, which is in many ways a rehash of our discussion of NAFTA many, many years ago, along with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, will poison the atmosphere for TTIP, or in a worst case scenario, cause this administration to abandon its trade agenda. But we shouldn't panic yet. It's not unusual for the House to vote for one thing and then vote another way and then be able to claim that they voted both ways. It's, I think, something most parliamentarians will recognize as legislative behavior. But it does raise some interesting questions about the relationship between trade, investment, and public attitudes, and how we can help our publics understand the value of trade. Let me just say that I think for those of us who, at the Atlantic Council, have worked on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the economic and strategic case for the agreement is very strong. And we'd be happy to, we can happily talk about that in the questions and with our panel here. But I think that where we are now is a discussion about moving the legislative agenda forward and creating a climate in which there's a constructive attitude about foreign trade and investment. We've had a similar week in the European Parliament, and we have some great people here to talk about this. Danuta Hübner, former European Commissioner and now an MEP and chair of the Constitutional Committee, and she's European People's Party, and Sorin Moisã, MEP from Romania, who is with the Socialists and Democrats, and one of the reporters on investor protection, which has been one of the hottest issues in the TTIP debates in Europe. But because the focus of this debate in Europe really has been on Germany, I want to start first with Aart Geus, who is the chairman of the Bertelsmann Foundation, an organization with which the Atlantic Council has sponsored several trade-oriented projects. And as I said, I wanted to make sure that this discussion is not just, we'll start on TTIP, but then I think we'll move out a bit into some broader questions. But Mr. de Geus, the key question I think that all of us are struggling to understand, at least from the American supporter of trade attitude, is why is Germany so difficult? It's a major exporting country. Germany has something like trade as a proportion of its GDP is something like 45% or something. In the United States, it's 13%. It's a whole different world. Does this opposition to TTIP that we see, is it a true reflection of what the German people think? And do they have a case? I mean, you've done work on whether trade is actually good for Europe and Germany. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you. And you're completely right. There is a huge debate in Germany, and maybe unexpected for the US, but what we see is that it mobilizes masses.
Right.
And you can only go back to the 80s when there was this discussion about NATO missiles to see mobilization of the public in that extent. Now, with the difference that it's now very much a social media campaign. So there is a huge concern. Now, how could that be? Because indeed, Germany is an exporting country. We have 10 million of jobs directly related to trade, and we are, but when you speak about a trade agreement, you have the export, you have the import, you have the partners and the trade. Let me briefly explain. On the export, we are already champions. So for Germans, there is not a huge concern, oh, please open the borders so we can export. We are already champions in export. The business is very supportive to TTIP, but the general public, it fell down, the support from 60 to 50%, it's now critical. Why is that? It has to do with the second. When you speak about trade, it's also about importing. What are we importing? We are concerned about the quality of the products, from bananas to chickens, medicine, safe cars, etc. And remember, Germany is rich. So the consumers in Germany rather like to maintain high quality standards than that they have an interest in lower prices. So for them, trade is very much a concern about standards. The support for harmonization of standards in the US is 70%. In Germany, it's only 45%, so less than half. And this has also to do with some fear. And this is the third point. Who is the partner on the other side of the agreement? It's the US, but it's not knowledgeable people like you, Francis. It is the big business of US that we fear. So we love our iPhone, but we don't like Google to know everything about us. And we all work with Facebook, but at the same time, you know, there is, and then we got this NSA scandal, so what is coming? And then we do not have all this discussion about this settlement for disputes. Should there be a leeway for investors to seek for their own, or should they follow the rules? So there is fear. There is fear for the big business of the US. And then also, this goes back in Germany, to understand that, it goes back a little bit to the old times of the DDR, Eastern Germany, where data and privacy was controlled by the government. We do not want that. And then last but not least, there is a comment on there's a feeling about the process. When it started, it was perceived to be a Brussels own process or an European Commission own process. And this is also the concern that the Germans say, well, you know, is this a hobby of Brussels, or is it really in our interest? So these are the areas to explain why it's difficult. There's a lot to do. I could elaborate on that, but you may want me to come back later on that.
Well, one question that has been of interest to me is, that I think is fascinating, is that your government, the German government, has been extremely firm on TTIP. Chancellor Merkel has been one of the big advocates, and even the Social Dems, the whole coalition has been pretty strong on this, despite not all of their constituents wanting them to do that. Does the opposition in some degree reflect a lack of confidence by German voters in what the government is telling them? Does it reflect a breakdown in that confidence or not?
We see an interesting change over time, because initially, when we as Bertelsmann Stiftung started to produce all kind of figures and data about the benefits, right. A trade agreement could bring, over a period of time, it could bring 170,000 more jobs in Germany. And all countries would benefit to a certain extent.
Right.
So we brought out that figures. And at that time, there was the idea also in the government, okay, this is good for Germany, so trade is good, let's go ahead. But then they did not take into account this fear, this concern about standards. And there is an interesting difference between the US and Germany. The US concern is about job losses.
Yeah.
Therefore, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific right. Partnership, is more sensitive in the US, I think, than the TTIP, because there is not a fear that that the US would lose jobs to right. To Europe, but they lose to China, etc. So, on the European side, it is about standards. Only 12% of the US people care about standards. 60% of the Germans. And on the other side, job losses, 50% of the US fear for job losses, only 17% of the Germans. So it's a mirroring. So what the German government had to do, and meanwhile is going to step in, is to take ownership of the process, and also to take into account some of these concerns. So what you see recently is that the Vice Chancellor, Sigmar Gabriel, stepped in, and he made a very clear point that a smart and trust-building solution for this dispute settlement, the ISDS, is a key for any TTIP agreement, TTIP agreement. So also on the other areas we have to work, but this is, the German government is starting, or is now, well, taking into account this concern, and now is taking a more political position also on the TTIP than just calculating the benefits.
Okay, all right. Let me go to Danuta Hübner. Ms. Hübner, I'd like to get a perspective from you on two cities, Brussels and Warsaw, or all of Poland, actually. What happened in the European Parliament last week, and does it say anything about long-term, about the Parliament's calculations on TTIP? But I'm also interested, we've heard some really fascinating stuff about Germany, lack of trust, opposition, concern about standards. Are these concerns shared by Poles at all? My impression has been, and please correct me, is that Poland is generally favorable towards TTIP, but I'm wondering how grounded and how firm that favorability is.
Well, thank you. Maybe before I go to Parliament and then to Poland, just one more comment to what we just heard from Bertelsmann, from Mr. De Geus. I think if you think last 10 years in Europe, basically the grand narrative of Europe as an open economy for which trade matters, this grand narrative on the role of trade in our development, on how it can boost, it's disappeared completely. We forgot it. It was back in 1990s, I think, the last time that we had this big discussion about how important trade and openness is. And then now, all of a sudden, comes TTIP, that is, for various reasons, brought to the attention of the public. And public is not prepared either, because we don't understand what trade means for us. And it's very easy to make people be afraid of the standards of their life and of everything that can come with such an agreement. So that's the first thing. Second is, of course, that we lost, because of the crisis, we lost what was very important always for Europe, which is trust in politicians, trust in institutions. So what you said, seeing TTIP also as Brussels-owned process, in spite of the fact that I think it's unprecedentedly open, transparent, and that we have never had such an interest and therefore such access to information on the agreement which is currently negotiated. So there are also those factors that due to the crisis, I think we as Europeans, we have lost also a lot of what in the past I think was more typical. We were more assertive. Today we are not. We see the America as a threat. We don't know that we have surplus in trade with America, that we have a lot of companies and goods which are extremely competitive on American market. We have, for example, because agriculture is one of those areas also where the fears are, we don't know in Europe that we have $9 billion of surplus in processed agricultural goods. And most likely in US, you will have more and more of the middle-class people that would have appetite for European farming goods. So I think a lot of things happened. On the top of that came complete lack of the role of governments in explaining, also in communicating. All the communication comes from Europe, and in national parliament very rarely. In Germany, I think Germany was one of the, Austria also, one of the first to start discussions. We don't see much of that in our member states, in other member states. So I think that there are many factors which are behind that, and we are not without being guilty. I mean, we, institutions, politicians, and so that I wanted to add. Now the parliament, why does it matter at all? Because I think many people still see the European projects as executive power projects. All of a sudden, Parliament is putting its fingers or noses into this process. And this comes from the fact that under the current treaty, the role of European Parliament in international negotiations, especially in trade agreements, has grown up, is important. And the Parliament will be the one who will be finally giving the consent, meaning approving the results of the negotiation. We don't know yet whether this will be also all the national parliaments. It's very likely that finally it will be decided that it's so-called mixed agreement, and everybody will have, in member states also, all the parliaments will have to ratify. That's why European Parliament is strongly involved. We are having all the briefings. We have a lot of dialogue with the Commission, with Commissioner, with main chief negotiators. So Parliament is very strongly involved. And we decided, which is not legally obligatory, we decided to have a kind of midterm resolution to confirm the commitment of European Parliament to the agreement and to express our views at this stage. And that's how this resolution was built up and grew a lot. I mean, it started as a small a proposal from the rapporteur, and then it has grown up. And we had, of course, problems with finding a consensus on, especially on ISDS issue. And in the committee, we managed, there is this coalition building process, we managed to have majority between all mainstream groups to pass it. But then it was absolutely clear that with more than 100 new amendments, there was a risk that it will not go through at the plenary session. So the president just took legally correct decision on the basis of a rule that we just postpone it to have more discussion, to have it back to the committee, so not to have to go through the risk that we might reject the resolution, right, which would mean that Parliament would not have the opportunity, would lose the opportunity to express itself. So that's what happened formally. But informally, the Parliament is, of course, divided, and we are, my private judgment is that no matter what we will finally have as the result of the negotiation, there will be probably 1/3 of the parliamentarians who will be against, because that just comes from the structure of the Parliament, from the mood, and from, you mentioned NSA, and this so-called NSA scandal is in the Parliament. This has its own life all the time.
Thank you. What about Poland?
Yeah.
Do you think that the Poles are committed to this? Not so much the government, but what do the Polish
You
people
remember
think
when
of
we
this?
were entering the European Union, we were seen as a Trojan horse. We were so strongly pro-American that everybody was afraid that here America comes to the European Union. Today, I can say that we don't have public opinion polls yet in Poland on TTIP. There's not much interest. However, in many discussions, we see that the ISDS issue, for example, through the civil society representative movements are very strongly raised and discussed. But we have a lot of small conferences. I just had myself yesterday one in Warsaw where we invite also businesses. We see, of course, concerns like the chemical industry, cosmetics industry, so the industries are doing a lot of studies, are preparing themselves. Government, I think, is strongly involved, is very positive in the Polish parliament. Also, for the time being, we will have a new parliament. We don't know yet what kind of parliament we will have, but it might be more skeptical. But today we don't have a lot of skepticism on this. But I think we are, on ISDS, we are even positive because that would be much better, the version from the Commission, than what we have in our bilateral agreement from 1990. So I think that in general, Poland is not yet, I think, in the mood and in the stage where we can say Poland is in favor or Poland is against. I think the businesses are generally in favor with all the concerns, sectoral concerns. The challenge for the political elites in Poland, but also in Europe, will be to see that we see also the big strategic importance of this agreement, not only the sectorial issues,
Right.
important as they are, because they might be extremely important, especially for smaller companies, for SMEs. But I think in general in Poland, we are not yet, I think, I wouldn't feel sort of today authorized to say that Poland is fully in favor of, us behind, with a positive attitude. But I think you can explain, because we understand when we were joining the union, we had all the fears about the trade. We were absolutely afraid that all those big guys developed, competitive, they will just digest us and consume us overnight. We saw that not. The trade, the single market, in fact, gave us a lot of, in terms of growth. So those fears probably will be repeated now, but I hope that we have also the capacity to explain to Poles that we might benefit.
Great. Let me bring in Sorin Moisã, the other political party group, to explain, do you agree with this explanation about the European Parliament that there's a way forward, but there will always be some opposition? Do you see the Parliament eventually adopting TTIP? And you've been at the center of the investor protection issue, and I know that it's really caught on with the public, despite its being rather complicated. And I wonder if you could say a few words about that. But I also wanted to come back to what Ms. Hübner said about a strategic agreement. It seems to me, and certainly in the United States, TTIP is viewed as not just economic benefits, but as saying something strategic about our relationship and about our credibility around the world. Does that type of argument gain traction here in Europe, or is that an American perspective?
Okay, well, I'll start with that. This is it's a fundamental point, I think. The truth of the matter is that in Europe, we have never looked really at the overarching arguments about the geopolitics of the TTIP or the strategic implications of the TTIP. We have used those words, but mostly as empty words, because we have not managed to actually strike the fundamental chords on that. And that is one of the reasons why we have completely lost the strategic initiative to the opponents of TTIP, who are relatively aggressive, probably not that numerous, but they use the social media in a very intelligent way to cover the horizon and mobilize probably a disproportionate size of public opinion against TTIP than would otherwise be the case. Now, I think, and this I would build on what Danuta just said, we have one of the fundamental problems, there's a longish list that we have in Europe, is mistrust in political elites and institutions. So we do not really trust, or many people do not really trust, this is the backdrop, those who negotiate on our behalf. We feel somehow that we might be betrayed, that our standards might be traded off cheaply for God knows what. And I think this is fundamentally false, but there is this widespread feeling. Now, you couple that with the aggressive opposition campaign, joyfully supported here and there. I'm not suggesting any conspiracy, but opponents of TTIP, among others, Russia, are happy to be catalysts whenever they can in this debate to put gas on fire against the TTIP. And there's some tradition in that with the peace movement in the 70s and so on. So, it's not necessarily a new game. Somebody mentioned in the previous debate short-range missiles in Germany in the previous life. So, I think the fundamental point that we failed to make so far is that the TTIP is about survival. It's a reflex, a fundamental intuition of our leaders, which was the correct intuition, as a survival instinct for the Western world in a changed, competitive environment on this planet. It is, for the first time after 500 years in the early modern age, the Western world is contracting, is being pushed back in its global projection. The TTIP is a response to that. It is a response about economic competitiveness. It's a response about maintaining the scale and the critical mass to be able to continue to have a decent central role, we, the Western world, on this planet, because we are being challenged by others who are becoming more and more sophisticated at doing things that we thought we would have a quasi-monopoly of doing. Technological sophistication, for instance, military sophistication. There was an article in The Economist yesterday about China really catching up on military technology with the US because now it's relatively easily available to them. So I think the narrative of survival, of maintaining our Western centrality in the world is one of the ways that we should try to reframe the debate. Now, I come back to earth. But what happened in Parliament last week, we would have had two options: to have either no resolution or to have a weak resolution. A resolution with a weak, the substance of the resolution was great. It was really good. We could not agree on an ISDS phrasing issue rather than substance. Even there, the substance was okay. And rather than have a weak majority for that silly issue, or no resolution at all for that silly reason, we preferred to postpone the vote, to sleep over it for a few weeks or months, and come back forcefully and hopefully with a strong majority and some decent phrasing on the ISDS issue. It was a collective decision in Parliament, and I think it was the wise one. I definitely think we will come back to it, and we will have a strong resolution on TTIP with a decent majority. There will always be people who will be against. Mm-hmm. There are those who are honestly against, and there are those who have become part of this opposition culture in Europe. It's so easy to say no to stuff. It's more difficult to make positive points, and there is, unfortunately, this is part of the conundrum that we're facing with our political establishment and elites, that the opposition culture offers relatively carefree careers to people rather than the hard work of building a positive case for the survival of your own society. And again, by survival, it's a metaphor for competitiveness. It's not that it's necessarily about physical survival. On ISDS, why are people so afraid of it? It's an expression of powerlessness in Europe. I mean, people have been having this feeling of losing power to Brussels. I mean, power more and more distant from where the real lives of people happen. TTIP is a sort of an extension, the ISDS, and TTIP too, to some extent, is an extension to that. I mean, if you're unhappy about having lost power to a faceless bureaucracy in Brussels, which tends to be quite arrogant and impersonal in dealing with things, just to take an example, in 2013 they had, and I have to take responsibility, I was in the Commission then, 2013 was the year of the citizens. Imagine that. And I wonder what 2014 would have been. I mean, all years are the years of the citizens. So they are bad communicators, heartless communicators. That's the truth. So people are frustrated with that. ISDS is an extension. When you lose power, not to an institution that you even indirectly or remotely control, you lose power to some strange ad hoc tribunals that nobody understands where they come from and where they go. And for each case, you have a tribunal. There is frustration there, and you can understand that. There's a lack of trust in leaders negotiating this. And then there are the flaws of ISDS itself, because it can be improved. And we have done, I think, great work in the past months, actually improving the animal.
Right.
It's completely different from what it was, and we need it to replace the old ISDS in BITs, which sometimes is rather enslaving for some of the signatories. Yes.
Sure. Thank you. Let me open to the audience now and see if there are questions. Yes, down here. And please identify yourself.
Hi, Sebastian Reme from CREAB, and also the Alliance for Responsible Commerce, which is a website that tries to educate about TTIP. It's funded by the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise. One of the challenges, I think, is to educate people properly about the content of TTIP and also to deal with some of the myths. For example, a big issue has been this chlorinated chicken argument. And I just wonder if the same people who make the most noise about chlorinated chicken
Eat salad.
then jump into a swimming pool where they probably consume more chlorine in one length than they would do in a lifetime of actually eating chlorinated chicken. It's a very small percentage. The same with the salad. Salad has been washed with very weak chlorinated water solution for many years, and also in Europe. So what do you think the solutions are to building up a proper body of information and understanding about TTIP? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
So let me just say, and I want to come to each of you for a quick suggestion. I think we are kind of caught on a dilemma here, because even though scientifically there's no problem with chlorinated chicken and salad greens, it actually doesn't sound great. So I think there is an image problem here, if we can put it that way. But I think it points to a more, the serious issue of how do we take the public, which is not going to they're not all going to become trade experts, or even close to it. How do we create confidence in the public that trade is okay? Germany, as you said, has had it and maybe feels like it has had enough. But I may be misinterpreting you, Aart.
I commend you for your efforts to educate the general public. And we also, as Bertelsmann Stiftung, we brought out figures about how many jobs could be created, etc. But that is on a rational level. We have to take into account that the fears around TTIP, as I explained, have different layers, emotional and very deep levels of trust in politics in general. So therefore, we believe that, number one, at a very bottom line, we have to come back to the narrative that trade is good. Trade is good, as you said. And it is a silver bullet in a time that the economy is stalling. Other efforts, like public investments, are costly. Austerity causes pain. Trade is a silver bullet to build peace and prosperity. Let's have that bottom line. And then secondly, indeed, sort out which concerns are legitimate and which concerns are fully hysterical. So if you do not take into account this, some serious concerns, how could you ever convince that you can build something good? Number three, I think it's extremely important that politicians, like parliamentarians, take the ownership of the negotiations. It should not be a mandate to some bureaucrats. It is the people want to see elected politicians responsible for these negotiations. This is the only way. If you are not concerned, then what should the people think? So the people want to see you in a role that you take the ownership of the negotiations. for better and for worse.
Can I ask, though, because the European Parliament has been voting on the mandate, and this was a midterm kind of review of the mandate, is that sufficient? Because it is hard to imagine negotiations proceeding with the Parliament actually involved in the negotiations, but maybe I'm wrong. Are there ways that Parliament could do that? Or Congress, for that matter?
Yeah. I think it's not a secret in Europe that we are extremely bad on communicating anything. We have failed totally even in communicating Europe to the citizens, and we think that those things like communication can be done from Brussels, which is, I think, completely wrong approach. Communication also on TTIP should be done locally, and we should just really feel all responsibility in explaining what really it can mean in the context of a concrete SMEs. We have a lot of hundreds of excellent examples which we can use, but they should also be used not only by a commissioner or a parliamentarian, but also by a local authority. We have this example, which is my favorite one, what TTIP can bring to somebody who is exporting oysters, a small company in Murcia in Spain who is exporting oysters to America, and the guy has to go all the time through this double recognition of the oysters in the American markets, because Americans, they check water in which oysters live, and we check animals, oysters themselves. And if we, thanks to the TTIP, we can have this from the point of view of the outcome, finally, food security, this is the same procedure in terms of outcome. We have to agree on this, that we treat it mutually as the same procedure. And this is an example of somebody who is locally active, who is providing jobs for people there. And this is from where the communication probably should come, through the local media also. So I think we are very bad on this, and I think this is something which we should really launch. And as you said, it's very easy probably to show the benefits of trade when we talk about tariffs, because we are reducing. Here we know that 80% of the benefits can come from the regulatory frameworks being changed, and not from harmonization, from dialogue, and not from tariffs. So this is also more difficult. But I think we can use the example of cars, that it would mean that even a small company which is assembling cars in Europe and exporting them to the US will not have to go again through the same procedure of recognition, of access to the market, of the approval of on the market, once we have TTIP in place. So I think there are really examples that can have impact on people's imagination and see their own life, but we just have to do much more on this. And this is up to us, because we have access to all the documents. We can read everything, we can even take note in the European Parliament. We of course have to use them in such a way that the needed confidentiality of negotiations is not sort of destroyed, but we can do a lot. So we just have to work together on this.
So let me ask Mr. Moisã, one of the ways of communicating is through social media, and yet social media on this particular issue is totally dominated by those who are opposed. I once saw a study that 95% of social media received in Germany on TTIP was negative. And I know that we put out a bi-weekly newsletter called TTIP Action at the Atlantic Council, and we get a lot of negative responses in that, and it's an e-newsletter. So is there something, I've talked to some government officials and they've pointed out how difficult it is for them to tweet immediately because they often have to get clearance. So parliamentarians, I know a lot of you do tweet and a lot about this particular issue, but is there something that we can do on social media? And then there's this, how do we reach out constructively?
That's a great question. I take that and then I try to answer the chlorinated chicken thing. I think the secret is to be able to find the right emotional charge in communicating for TTIP too, which is exactly what the gentleman with the chlorinated chicken is not doing. I come back to you. And then find allies in European society, which a lot of social capital with credibility, which do not have a direct interest or involvement in TTIP, who are not bureaucrats or governments or corporations, the corporate world, and that could have significant traction on society, explaining things. And I think the most intelligent way that we can do it is put it in this survival paradigm that, you know, we need to stay competitive and be able to keep our way of life and our values and the way we breathe, the way we do things. And this should be done by people who are not suspected of being parts of this network of power not to be trusted. Unfortunately, we politicians, of course, it's our role to do it. And hopefully we can do it credibly, ever more credibly. But you know, it's this curse that we as a class, as a group, we are not being that trusted. So that's an individual game of trying to gain some social traction rather than simply popularity in a narrow sense. Now back to the chlorinated chicken. I agree with you that it's not poisonous. There's nothing wrong in the end, and you know, people do not tend to die in America for eating chlorinated chicken. But this debate is a bit more sophisticated than that. It's philosophical, but about some values on the one hand, and about competitiveness of our poultry industry on the other hand, which is very serious. So we have this farm-to-fork philosophy in Europe. So maybe there's nothing wrong with chlorinated chicken, but there's definitely nothing wrong with chicken washed with water and a bit of vinegar at the end of its life. That's even less harmful, I would say. So we have this farm-to-fork philosophy where we look tenderly after our poultry since they were little chicks until the end of their life. And at the end, we don't have to do anything else but wash them with water. These are our rules. In the US, they tend to, it's almost, I mean, it's even more heavily industrialized than in Europe, this industry. And they do not have much regulation as to throughout the life of the chicken, and at the end they wash them nicely in chlorine, and they are edible, no problem. I mean, if my fellow Europeans prefer the more careful approach, I can only agree with that. I mean, this is one of the arguments which sort of morally and socially, I think we have to win ourselves vis-à-vis the US rather than simply sort of mock our own fellow Europeans because they're not rational enough that you jump in a pool. If you make that argument, you lose a lot of support. I mean, I think, okay, and for the industry, I mean, our industry has to respect all these rules farm to fork. It's more expensive. If you simply allow chlorinated chicken, then they lose a competitive edge. So you lose society, you lose the industry. I don't know what role that plays. So we shouldn't hate our own standards. I mean, there are areas in which the Americans could be more reasonable and areas where they do things better and we could accept those standards. So I'm not sure that's the way to go about it. Yes.
So we're going to wrap up in a minute or two, but I wanted to give Ms. Hübner a response and also Aart, if you have a response.
Because I think that was now what Sorin mentioned, the question of competition or competitiveness of European industry and American industry, and this is something which is extremely important. And if we really think that what is the real life, the fact of life, is that American companies have advantage over European companies when it comes to the cost of energy. And that's why, for example, for us, the chapter on energy in TTIP is so fundamental. So behind all those issues, there are also the real problems that we are facing and that also translate into negotiation. And the second thing in this context, that one thing is competitiveness, comparing the American and European, and some fears on both sides. But the second thing which we seem not to really appreciate is that we both are under risk when it comes to our competitiveness in the global context. We are losing on many sectors where we both used to be competitive, and I think here even on renewable energy equipment, and I think here also on ICT and on many other areas. So there is a space for our cooperation through which we can make ourselves globally more competitive, where we can win if we are together on the basis of the TTIP cooperating, and that's why also this aspect, this dimension that is so important, especially for SMEs, but not only, this is something which you also have to talk about. It's not only fears of consumers, but it's also the facts of life when it comes to competitiveness of our industries.
Right. Final comment?
Yes, please. Thank you. I want to build on the thoughts that you brought in about the survival strategy, the narrative. Let me amend it a little bit and put it in the context of the fair deal for trade for the future. Because we know we need trade to build peace and prosperities. We prefer trade over war to build peace. Do we? Okay, so we want to build it. If we, in the Western world, will not create a fair context for trade, others will do it. And it's happening already. It's happening already. So what is happening in the world, it's not that we will have a world trade order. Doha will not be completed. So the idea to build a world order is gone. It's the 20th century. We are entering the 21st century where we will have regional trade agreements, and these will be in Asia, these will be in Africa, etc., maybe trans-Pacific, maybe transatlantic, but these will be the trade landscape. Now the question that we have to ask ourselves is not if we want to have TTIP. We need it in order to set the context for a fair deal on trade. And that should be the strategic objective. And in that one, the politics have to take into concern and to also to show the leadership, to be very, very constructive, to be pro-trade, but also to take into concerns the real chances that we have. And there is still a majority in Europe in favor of a trade agreement. We can capitalize on that, but we have to take into account these serious concerns and then the leadership. And then if we do that, I'm sure there will be a moment more favorable than today or yesterday. There will be a moment that we will succeed. It may take some time, but it's the only way forward.
Right. I want to thank the panel. We have to come to a conclusion right now. I do want to say, I mean, often when in Washington and we're talking about TTIP, we get down to the nuts and bolts and we find ourselves going, why are those Europeans being so difficult about ISDS, investor protection, and farm to fork, and all this kind of stuff? How can they say that TTIP will lower their standards? So I want to thank you especially for illuminating some of the rationalizations, the thinking, the fears, in some cases, behind the European debate. Because I think we can argue about the benefits of trade, the economic benefits of trade, and bring out our statistics as much as we want. But until we address those fears, and until we address suspicions and a different way of looking at things, we won't have a firm foundation. We won't, as Ms. Hübner said, reawaken this narrative about trade that used to exist in Europe, about it being the thing that was binding Europe together and the way to prosperity. So thanks to all of you very much. And join me in a round of applause. And